Hello, welcome. Hello.
Hi. Melissa, nice to see you.
Hello.
Someone somewhere nice and sunny.
Oh, Maria.
Hello.
Making everyone jealous.
Please go.
Well,
Okay. I think we've let everyone in the lobby. Oh no, a couple more coming as well. So we think everyone's here, and then we get started.
okay. So welcome everybody. I'm going to do the introductions. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? So this is our second symposium talk of the really fantastic tutors on the RIBA Studio. I think through the summer, it's been really excellent to drop in to just keep the momentum going on the academic thinking. And of course, this video series is going to form an important part of our library, recorded library. So today we want to welcome Khisha Clarke and Ralph Saull, who in my experience are just two of the most fantastic year one tutors. That unlocking moment is probably the most challenging point in the architectural journey, to be a fantastic tutor. So we're really pleased that not only at Oxford Brookes, but also in different respects part of the RIBA Studio as well. So thank you very much for your contributions today and for the time you've taken to do this. And to the RIBA, thank you for setting this all up. And I guess I hand it over to you. Joe, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Maria. No, just again, welcome on behalf of the RIBA to the series, and a big thank you to Ralph and Khisha for taking us through the session in a minute. We are recording the session, so it will be posted on our YouTube channel. If you do need to drop out for any reason, you can catch up on it afterwards. Just in terms of housekeeping, you're very welcome to keep your cameras on if you wish, or switch them off. At the end, we're going to do a Q&A, so if you wanted to use the raise your hand function, we'll do our best to kind of go through that in the correct order. Forgive us if we don't quite manage that. If you have questions, or equally if you'd prefer to put them in the chat, then we might call on you to don't be shy and come on camera and kind of pose your question that way. But I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. So just thank you very much, and over to Ralph and Khisha.
Okay, great. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see the student portfolio. That's it. Now we can see the presentation. Thanks.
Great, excellent. So thank you, Joanna and Maria, for kind of introing us into this. And so our talk is called From the Ground Up, Unlocking Year One. And just to give you an idea of how the talk is going to go, it's going to be a 35-minute talk with a 25-minute Q&A. And as Joe has said, please do use the chat to ask any questions. We're going to try and keep an eye on it during the presentation. But we would like to see your faces and hear your voices at the end of this. So what are the learning aims of this? Well, me and Ralph had long discussions about this, and we want to use this as an opportunity for you to use, well, we have used it as an opportunity actually to use the lens of kind of looking at collective network groups to help you understand whether it's your current situation, whether you're currently in first year or doing the foundation course, or your past learning experiences, or if you're thinking of doing an architecture degree, your future year one experiences. So to give you an idea of ways that you could then unlock your potential to do the best that you can do in first year, or to reflect on your past first year experiences and what you got out of it. And then the other aim of this is for you to contribute to the discussion about improving year one pedagogy or year one teaching. So who are we? Maria gave you a little hint. So I'm Khisha Clarke, and I'm a first year tutor at Oxford Brookes University. I'm part of the RIBA Foundation team. I'm part of the RIBA Studio team, and I'm also a practicing architect based in London. Ralph?
Yeah, thanks. And I think the images give a flavour of what we get up to outside of those jobs, but very much similar to Khisha. I also we co-lead the year one full-time course together at Oxford Brookes. I'm a practicing architect, and I have some small inputs in the RIBA Foundation and RIBA Studio courses over the course of the year.
Great. So now that we know who we are, well, me and Ralph are, the question is, who are you? And we are hoping that you're a mixture of students, whether that's a past student, a current student, or a potential student, so someone who's thinking of embarking on your architecture studies. Or it might be that you're a tutor, and again, that might be a tutor with years of experience, or it might be someone who's just at the beginning of their tutor journey and thinking about becoming a new tutor, or thinking about teaching architecture in the future. So if you can give us an idea of who you are, you can use the reaction emojis. Ralph is going to tell you where they are. And Ralph, can you tell them where they are?
Yeah, if you're using the app, top right, there's a button that says reactions, a smiley face with a hand next to it. If you want to just click that, and the first question is, are you a current student of architecture? Put a thumbs up emoji if yes. Get a sense of who's in the room as a current student. Or use the chat to tell me if you're struggling to find the hi Kenton, thanks for popping your hand up there. Okay.
If you are a tutor or a potential tutor, perhaps you can raise your hand.
Yeah, do a love heart if you're a tutor.
Oh, a love heart, yes. That tells you how much love this is.
We've gone off with the hands already, but that's all right. So Craig, Melissa, Joe, well, thank you for popping your hands up there. Great, so mixed audience, Khisha, so let's crack on.
Excellent. Also, if you can just use the chat just to say a quick hi. So just use the chat, say hello. So, you know, one of the things we learned when we were tutoring first year in lockdown was this engagement, even if you're online, is really important. Being able to see each other and speak to each other. So, you know who Ralph and I are, you know who you are. Let's talk to you a little bit about the different routes of studying architecture. We've looked at 3 courses, just so that you understand kind of where you might be in this kind of framework. So you have the full-time course in architecture, which is 3 years. And that's when you are full-time, you're starting with the same cohort of students in the university over a period of time. So you're all together, working together in the same place and at the same pace. Then you have the RIBA Foundation course, which is a 1-year course leading you to studying architecture. So it's helping you to prepare a portfolio so that you could then apply for the first year of an architecture course, whether that's a full-time course or whether it's something like the RIBA certificate. Now, the RIBA certificate is a 4-year course, different to the full-time course in that it's a distance learning course, like the RIBA Foundation. The RIBA Foundation is also a distance learning course. The RIBA certificate allows you to be in full-time employment as an architect or as in an architectural practice or with somebody who is ARB registered. And it has the flexibility of almost up to 12 years. So whilst you're working, you're studying at the same time. So those are 3 different routes that you can use to study architecture, but all of them have a first year. All of them you begin somewhere. So Ralph, you want to tell us about the shorthand terms for the different stages of each one of those courses?
Yeah, just mindful that this is being recorded and that some people might be looking at this resource thinking this is something I'm heading into, and you may just hear lots of vocabulary flying around. If you look at the 2 middle columns there, those are all the different names that someone might conversationally refer to as someone studying their first part, their degree level qualifications, and the second column is what people might refer to as this second part 2, master's level qualifications. All sorts of names flying around. So I hope that little diagram just decodes a little bit. So you've got in the left-hand column there foundations hanging out on its own there, and on the right-hand side, if you go so far as to fully qualify as an architect, your professional exams, or your part 3 as it's kind of known in the ARB context. Yeah, next slide, Khisha, thanks.
And of course, across all of these courses, there'll be shared experiences.
Definitely, and I think that's the part of our experience, Khisha and I specifically, that we can speak to, and then in the Q&A, we'd love to know your observations, kind of cross-course observations. But this diagram was our first sort of scribbly attempt to just put down some of the differences in terms of workload and time between the different courses. Manifestly, there are some like universal common issues which such as basic skills acquisition, which are common to learning architecture in your first year, no matter whether you're studying full-time, part-time, foundation, degree, whatever. But there's going to be different sort of times of the year when you're busy or not. And that can have a big impact in how you then engage with the other networks around you, friends and families. And that's the lens through which we're going to look at stuff in the next few slides. But let's just look at when people are busy. So the red line kind of represents the workload over time in a typical year for a full-time degree student. So you can see there's a big, steady accumulation of workload between September and December, whereupon all the hand-ins go in, and you've got really not much to do over Christmas. And the same pattern of working very hard for 12 weeks it's repeated after the Christmas period, and the hand-ins end of May. So, you know, you can look at the kind of volume of workload under that line, if you imagine the area bounded under that line, and it is in theory equal to studying in different mode. But let's jump to the blue line, the RIBA Studio line. You can see that those peaks and troughs, and this is very much just a sketchy diagram that Khisha and I just put together very indicatively. But those peaks and troughs allow you a little more, even when there's a peak, a little more scope to be able to deal with all the other things flexibly in your life that are going on. So it's a little and often approach to the same thing. So that, even though in your first year of studying architecture, you have to acquire the same skills, test the same skills, learn to be a kind of, you know, learn to be a critical thinker and a reflective thinker, that the intensity is very different. And the yellow line there just represents the RIBA foundation year, which starts a little bit later, ramps up a little bit more slowly, and there's a slightly different configuration of pauses and deadlines and so on. But it was a useful graphic for us just to understand the pressures that people are facing at different times in the year.
Great. So, unlocking your potential, what does this actually mean? And how we wanted to frame it was this idea of freeing you from restraints or restrictions, and acknowledging that whichever course you're on, whether it's a full-time course, certificate course, or the foundation course, is about acknowledging a new beginning. So you're starting fresh, and using the diversity of your different experiences, whether you're coming from A-levels or whether you've been in practice for 20 years, to enable you to, again, unlock that potential. And then maximizing those networks that we're going to talk a little bit more about later, and how those different networks overlap to help you to kind of harness that potential to push you forward kind of on whichever course you're choosing to do or that you are currently doing. Our approach was to look at this through a series of different lenses. So we are going to look at the kind of collective learning community, the idea of unlocking mindset, so that's unlocking kind of your way of thinking, and then how that can lead to creativity and critical thinking, and then how you deal with feedback and failure, which is a big part of this course. And we want to define actually what failure is, and failure is a good thing in our eyes. So let's start with collective and kind of creating these new kind of network overlaps and what those networks are for each of you. Ralph, do you want to talk about these diagrams?
Yeah, again, just to caveat this, there's no sort of, this isn't an official version. It just was helpful when we were talking to put some diagrams down. So feel free to contest these and tell us that they're wrong. But I think when we thought about the people around you when you're studying architecture, in particular in your first year in each of these circumstances, those people around you can help you unlock your potential in different ways. For example, your professional network are going to give you a particular steer and a particular set of skills, but also a particular philosophy, which could be both helpful and unhelpful at certain times. Your friends and family as well also have the potential to be enormously supportive, but also to be a competing, aspect which you have to learn to balance. Your peer and student network in some contexts can be really, really extensive and very, very powerful. In others, they can feel a little bit far away and plenty of potential to unlock, which is what we're going to talk about. And your tutor and educator network, as a student, it's very interesting, but also we've got lots of current RIBA Studio and Foundation tutors on the call today, who it's useful for them to understand where they sit in relation to that student's experience or exposure to practice networks and peer networks as well. So just taking the diagrams a little bit one at a time. The left-hand column there, representing the full-time degree, shows that the black dot in the centre there, being the individual, is well placed within a large blue ring of pool of students. In the full-time course at Oxford Brookes, we typically have about 150 students, and there's a great big overlap between the people who you would consider your peers, your student network, and your friends. Okay, so there's quite comfortably people make friends with the people they're studying with quite naturally, organically, because they're with them in the studio 2 or 3 days a week solidly. If you look at that same overlap or potential overlap of networks in the RIBA Foundation or RIBA Studio models, they're a little bit more distant. It's perhaps because of the remote and online nature of the course harder. It's not a natural thing that necessarily your peer and friendship circles would necessarily overlap. So it's an opportunity that people could unlock by acknowledging that and proactively to sort of changing that circumstance. Very interestingly, and always part of the kind of critical debate around how architects should study and learn, and the rise of apprenticeships and so on, the relationship between an individual and practice, which represented here in the relative red or red dotted rings, you can see the disadvantage of people studying the full-time degree is that they're, especially in first year, somewhat disconnected from the real world. And the huge advantage of the RIBA Foundation with its 200 hour experience of practice work, or in the RIBA Studio model where you're actually embedded in a practice, there's a much greater chance that that overlap between your professional network and your friendship network is going to have more common ground than the peer network. So I think in doing these diagrams and being a tutor who teaches across all three, I get a sense of how I can encourage students to look at where there are natural opportunities within the course structure and where they're at a disadvantage and they have to work more proactively to make those networks work for them and to unlock the potential of having exposure to those individuals. The bit I haven't talked about really is the relationship between tutors. That's the green bit here. And with the full-time degree, students get exposure to a big raft of different tutors teaching different modules across the 3 years of their education. With the RIBA Foundation and RIBA Studio models, it's a bit more intimate in that you have your personal tutor, and then you have your the course leaders that are facilitating things. Also, you have someone working in a mentoring role in the practice to you. Let's go on to the next slide because we'll come back to talk about these with respect to each of the headings, I think.
One thing to remember about, when you think back to this slide is that all of these networks, whether it's your professional, your friends and family, peers or tutors, all of them are part of your kind of learning community, and all of them will help you to kind of unlock that potential. So you can't just rely on one and not the other. All of them have to have a kind of understanding of what you're doing. So if we, sorry, go on.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Khisha. Yeah, so I was just going to jump in and say here that I think because we have got quite a lot of tutors on the call, this one goes two ways. Establishing your tutor as a critical friend, in inverted commas, the sort of idea that someone can be critical, but in a way that is positive and helpful to you. It might be a dynamic of a relationship that a student coming into that context has not experienced before, either if they're coming from a professional background via their studio route or from a background of having just done A-levels and transitioning to that higher education mindset and way of thinking. So the challenge to anyone teaching year one is, do you just sort of jump straight in there and start being a critical friend, or do you actually involve students in a discourse around how you're giving them feedback and how you're building that relationship with them? Khisha, over to you.
Yeah, I think across all courses, that relationship with the tutor is really important to your progress on the course. Now, obviously, in the full-time education, we are there all the time with the students. We're there twice a week, all day. On the RIBA Foundation course, you have your personal tutor, and on the studio course, you also have your personal tutor. And so that relationship becomes very, very important. And it's important that you think about maybe how you learned in the past to kind of then thinking about how you shift to your learning now and that relationship with the tutor. And that relationship is a two-way relationship. It's not one way. And how it starts is almost as a conversation. Your tutor your tutor is not there to tell you what to do, but to help you have a discussion about what you're doing, what your ideas are, how you progress those ideas, and to help you think of things in a different way. So as a tutor, how do you do that? Well, first of all, you listen to the student and you build up an understanding of what makes that student tick and what their desires are, and you're trying to draw out of the student their ideas, but also the joy that they're trying to get from what they're doing. You're trying to encourage them along that journey of designing their project or developing their proposal. And in order for your tutor to do that, first of all, you have to see your tutor. You have to make sure and see your tutor regularly and often, and that you partake in that discussion with the tutor. Because the tutor is not telling you what to design. They're reacting to what you have brought to them as a student. Once that kind of rhythm has been set up of seeing your tutor and having discussions with the tutor, or the tutor also checking up on you and understanding what's happening, it's then about questioning and being able for the tutor to be able to question the student about what they're doing, and it's likewise for the student to be able to ask questions of the tutor to push that conversation forward. And to do that, it's important that whether you have work or you don't have work, that you turn up for the conversation without fear of being put down or critiqued. The conversations are actually about the work. They're not about your personality. It's not about you as a person, but they are about the work that's being discussed.
I think that point's super important to emphasise, Khisha. I couldn't agree more that people perhaps find it hard to transition to making that detachment, that you can speak about the work that exists outside of you. It's what you have externalized by that point. It's not a slight on you or your progress. It's just what is on the table that you're able to talk about. I think students sometimes take a bit of, it takes all of first year maybe to kind of accept that. But also I was going to add that one thing that is a really honest intention that sometimes leaves people a little bit perplexed is that I think, especially in year one, yes, there's curriculums, but mostly we want you to be thinking and working like an architect. So what we're interested in is your learning journey, that you grow in that respect, that you're able to start thinking like an architect and learning to kind of go through those motions, pick up that vocabulary. So we're interested in the learning component. And if you think about someone coming from an A-level context, the sort of, speaking cynically here, the motivation perhaps of people, the relationship they may have had from teachers coaching people towards good A-level results might have been towards getting good A-level results, as opposed to perhaps just the love of learning and being a good learner, and shaping a good learner. And perhaps if you're used to taking direction, criticism, observations from someone in a professional context, a boss, line manager, someone along those lines, then it's towards particular results and metrics. And actually, in that first year experience, the whole interaction is designed just to make sure you're on the right path and that you're learning and that you're enjoying yourself. And so it's really honestly intentioned, but sometimes perhaps first years coming and adapting from one of those two mentalities I've just described struggle with that a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember your tutor, in the back of their eye, they might be interested in the marks that you get, but they're really not interested in your marks or the final kind of whether you get a distinction or a merit or a pass or a fail. They're interested in that learning journey and that you've progressed and the ideas that you're bringing. And that, a lot of you may already have been working for years and years and years. Think about how you learned in the past and how you learn now. And once your tutor understands how you learn, they begin to tap in. It'll be different for every student and it'll be different for every tutor, and how to then draw that out of you. The other thing to understand is that the tutor is not there to teach you a computer program or CAD skills, but they're there to help you and offer up different tools for learning and different ways of approaching something, different ways of looking at something. So if you are stuck, this is where the tutor becomes really important. There's a tendency in first year, if someone's stuck or had a deadline at work, they've been too busy, they haven't managed to do the work they've managed to do, the tendency is not to go to a tutorial. This is absolutely not the answer. And that's the point where you want to have a conversation with your tutor. That's the point where you need their help their most. And that's the point where they're wishing you would have come and seen me as a tutor, or Ralph as a tutor, or whoever, Adam, Melissa, whoever your tutor is, so that they can begin to unlock with that block that you're having. They can ask you questions. They can ask you, where does this really want to go? What do you really enjoy doing it? I can see you've got an idea, but I'm not quite sure of how you want to express it. Let's talk about that. Those are the points where it's really important that you see your tutor. So it's that regularity, and the relationship with your tutor means that you are at no point afraid to talk to your tutor. That's very important. You shouldn't be afraid to see and speak to your tutor, because they're there to help you along this process, not to fail or pass you. That's not the point of them.
So onward to unlocking peer potential, and just timing wise, Khisha, we might need to take them a little bit quicker. But under unlocking peer potential is firstly to recognise that it is a really highly valuable source of learning. We often say you'll learn more from each other than you will from us, which sounds sort of like a bit self-humbling or whatever, but it's absolutely true. And I think students will attest to that we're here to guide, but it's that mutual learning experience that's really beneficial, both in terms of people's enjoyment, social, and that overlap between social and peer networks, but also just the acquisition of skills. We only have so much contact time with people, and so it's the hours spent after the lecture about how to draw in CAD with friends, overcoming common issues, having a debate about how it could have been explained better, and here's a better tutorial I found online. All these kind of things. That's great, because then it means that there's a sort of network of sharing ideas and resources, which far exceeds what a course can offer as a sort of contact time experience. One thing that is kind of so there's a positive side. I think one thing which can be something which prevents you from unlocking your potential within a peer group is if there's a sort of averaging effect. There's a sort of adage that you become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with or something. Well, in a kind of a more sort of conservative approach to meeting deadlines or achieving assignments that have been set, if everyone kind of aims for the average of what the other person is doing, it has a sort of suppressing effect. You don't get those really bright sparks or left field ideas that push new thinking. So whilst it's to be encouraged that you learn from each other, it's also really important that people sort of have the confidence to distinguish themselves and find differences and celebrate that diversity and individualism within that.
Also, if you look at the full-time course, they have the benefit of being physically in the same space. They can see each other's work. They talk to each other naturally during the day, and they're inspired by each other. On the distance learning, you have to take the initiative to create that peer network and have that peer-to-peer learning, to share each other's work. And lockdown has shown us, you can set up WhatsApp groups, Zoom calls, you can share work through drives, etc. But it's really important that you create that network for different reasons. One is to inspire and share work, but it's also to inspire and share stresses. And you guys have an understanding of what the course is like, what it's on, when there's crunch points that we showed you in the diagrams. And it's important that you can kind of share the load and have those discussions amongst yourselves, because that makes the course a lot easier.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that we advocate for is reflective practice, and it's something we do on the full-time course with our students. Is we do some reflective practice questionnaires. We set up seminar discussions in the form of reflective practice discussion, which is a scholarly sort of school of thought by a thinker called Gibbs. You can go and have a look at it, but we frame the whole thing quite formally. But what happens informally when peer networks are really successful on a course is that later down the line, when people are decompressing or reflecting naturally, organically, someone says, I felt really insecure at that point in time. Someone says, yeah, so did I. And then it's kind of like you can move to the next stage of the reflective cycle, which is, why did I feel that way? How can, now we both realize we felt that way, how are we going to avoid feeling that way in the future? And you start to make that action plan that takes you back to the top of the reflective cycle loop. So whether or not you're doing it as a kind of conscious structured practice, or whether you're just optimizing that network collective, it's extremely helpful in helping you recognize that as you move through one student project to another, or one practice project to another, you're always circling back into a loop of being better at what you do, and you should be always sort of frustrating and seeking to improve to make the experience really enjoyable. Yeah,
and we have a saying in the Caribbean: each one teach one, and that's kind of what this peer network does and the potential that it has. And if I was to relate this back to practice, there's a lot of practices that have been set up by people who were studying together by those relationships that were made together. And so that's why this peer network takes you beyond the studio or whatever course you're doing, whether you're on a distance course or a physical course. That network is extremely important.
And hard transitions are really bad. So the digital world creates this situation where we're now all in a room together, and then as soon as the Zoom call finishes in 25 minutes time, we will not be in a room together, and that's a really hard transition. And I know that as the students are queuing up for a lecture or leaving a lecture, and then they sit down afterwards, go and have lunch after a lecture on the full-time course, that's actually when a lot of the kind of like, okay, so what are we actually going to do? You know, we had the lecture, now what do we actually have to do to move forward with this thing? That's when that discussion happens. So if you're an RIBA Studio tutor or student and you think, oh, actually that applies to us or my students, there is this kind of hard transition. Yeah, maybe there's some work to do around softening those, blurring those overlaps a little bit between your networks. We're now moving on to talking about the professional environment and how that can be enhanced to unlock more potential. So I'll just explain the photograph. This is my practice that I've been part of for the last 11 years, WWA Studios. And just to kind of explain the picture a little bit, the person taking the photograph is currently studying to be an access consultant. We've got someone there who's just studying, I think has just got his Passive House accreditation. There's one person there who's currently an apprentice, nearly finishing his degree. There's an RIBA Studio student in that photograph as well. And the point I'm trying to make by explaining that is this collective of people are all continuously learning. We all consider ourselves students. And so if you're an RIBA student and RIBA Studio student and you're in the practice environment, it would be a mistake to think of those people around you as finished products, as people who are telling you, well, how it is in reality, because they're still developing their idea about what things are. They're still learning themselves. So don't, again, thinking about those hard transitions and labeling things, those are also your peer learners as well, if you treat them as such, and if you create a collegiate and sort of learning culture at the practice that you work at, and you can be very much part of that. And I think we really enjoy having that mix of students around, and you'll find that practices that take on RIBA Studio students or apprentices or whatever, they do so because that is what they want. So you doing that is not going to meet any resistance or kind of waste or feel as though it's wasting any time. You kind of instigating that and taking that license is exactly why you were brought into the fold in the first place.
So the other thing to understand is obviously you're all coming from different backgrounds, and okay, in the full-time course they may be very far away, if you remember that diagram, the Venn diagrams we had earlier, from the kind of professional world, whereas in the RIBA Foundation and the RIBA Studio courses you're much closer to this kind of professional environment. And you can think of this professional environment in two ways. One is about the way you work, so setting up your kind of workflow in terms of, I'm maybe going to work between 9 and 5, or I can only work in these hours. How do I work? How do I set my timetables and understand when my deadlines are and when my calendars are? So kind of thinking of yourself as a professional and your approach to work as a professional. The other way to think about it is that a lot of you may already be in employment, whether that's in an architectural practice or a completely different field. I'm going to talk first about the completely different field, because there's a lot that has to bring to it, to studying first year. All these past experiences come to bear on how you approach your projects, the things that you might want to research within a project, the type of project that you might want to do. You're often given a brief, and it's up to you the direction that you take that brief in. Because architecture is often about the way we live and how we are in society, both the kind of sociological part of that, the social part of that, as well as the physical. And so your prior experiences in work may come to bear on what you're doing in a project and how you're developing a project. So I don't want you to forget that whatever professional background you come from, that can feed into how you study in your first year in an architecture program. If you're in an architecture practice, so that's whether you're kind of doing your 200 hours as an RIBA Foundation student or you're in full-time practice as an RIBA Studio student, you have then got this professional network to tap into, who are part of your learning environment. They need to understand the course that you're on, as your tutor does. They need to understand the pressures that you have from the course and how that fits into your working life and working environment. And that's actually whether you're in a completely different field or whether you're in the architecture field. But then you've also got all these people to draw on. First, there's your practice mentor, if you've got one, which you should have if you're on the RIBA Studio. It's the consultants that you work with, so the engineers, the M&E consultants, the lighting consultants, all of them, you can tell them about what you're doing, tell them about the projects that you're working on. And then there's also the other people who are working on the practice, who who you can share what you're doing with, and they can take an interest in what you're doing, and they can act as almost like additional tutors to encourage you, to tell them about their experiences, because they all may have been on this journey before as well. And that can help feed into your project. The other thing to understand is that when you're in an architecture course, the projects have a different life to the projects that you have in practice. There's a kind of creative freedom that you have when you're studying in an architecture course. And I can tell you, the people who are working in practice or in whatever job you're working in would love to hear about that and have their own creativity stirred by what you're looking at in your kind of proposals through your design briefs. And so what you're doing on this course can then feed back into the practice that you're working in or the job that you're working in, whether you're teaching, whether you're working in music, whether you're in arts, this can all feed back into it. So there's, again, that two-way relationship between your professional environment and your academic environment that you're studying in. Ralph, is there anything that you want to add?
I'm just mindful about time. So what I'm thinking, Khisha, we'll do is we'll just cover some quick points on the next slide, and then we'll take the 4 other themes much quicker and perhaps use them as a backdrop to field questions in the Q&A. So yeah, talking about unlocking friends and family on sort of that is a network that, if you would think all the way back to that first diagram where we had the peaks and troughs of workload, they're going to be integral into kind of dovetailing into those peaks and troughs of the time that you're dedicating towards study. And so setting out a roadmap and making them understand, and almost creating a sort of informal contract between the people that you're closest with about when you're studying and when you're not, that can be a really helpful thing to do. There's always the saying that if you can explain a project conceptually to your grandma, then you can explain it to anyone. So I think that really stands that you should try and bring people in to what you're doing, and use them as a sort of sounding platform. So if you can do that, then you're going to have much more sort of understanding throughout that process of trying to make it dovetail with the rest of your life.
So now all of those people in the collective have an understanding of, and you hopefully have an understanding of how they impact on your learning. Let's talk a little bit about unlocking mindsets. And we want to tell you, you get what you put in. So as a kind of first year architecture student or foundation student, you need to think it's about unlearning what you've learned before and being open and willing to a new way of learning and considering these new ways of learning and being open to ideas and creativity, input, critique, whether you've been in a professional environment for a long time, understanding that, okay, I've got all this experience, but now I'm opening to a new way of doing things. And it requires a certain kind of humbleness to kind of put that aside and say, I'm open to starting from fresh. I'm open to look at things at different ways. If I've been doing things in a certain way for a long time, how can we now look at the opportunities or the possibilities of doing this differently to create innovation, to create different ways of doing it? If you're coming from an education background, let's say A-levels or university, that this may be a different way of studying than it might have been to how you did it in the past. And so we want to get to grips with the importance of openness and willingness to be able to do that, to unlock your way of thinking and see the potential for thinking in new ways.
Definitely, and I think there's a sort of often a perceived contradiction here, because on the one hand, we're sort of saying we want everyone to capitalize on their individual identity, their existing set of skills, leverage the existing skills they've got, and celebrate their individualism, which sometimes comes out in the way you express yourself and the skills that you've acquired to that point. So it's then contradictory to say, no, unlearn all of that, and you will find that there'll be modes of feedback, tutorials, crits or something where you're hearing opposite ends of that sentiment. But it quite often important to separate the learning experience from the product. And sometimes, you know, if you tend to do something the way you've always done it, or think about something the way you've always done it, the product will end up the same. And so when someone is asking you to unlearn and think differently, they're asking you to, it's about the learning experience, it's about learning differently, and that will yield a different product at the end. So there's a sort of dual thread there.
And hopefully that end product is creativity and critical thinking. So first of all, what do you think about the poetic expression versus the reality? You know, often people might get a project and say design a school, and they think, well, okay, a school needs classrooms and it needs a teacher, it needs a blackboard, whatever. But what we want to think about is actually, what could a school be? What are the different ways of learning? So it's that poetic expression versus reality. This is your chance in first year to be really creative and really innovative, and to research things you might not have thought about researching before, to do things that haven't been done before. It's an opportunity for you to develop your critical thinking and to question what you're doing. So it's sorry, Ralph, go on.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that with this particular example on the screen at the moment was a project made out experimenting with what can you do by using gummy bears and illuminating them and testing them at facade scale and urban scale. And, you know, there's fun to that, but then there's the execution of it's incredibly serious and highly executed. So it then lends itself as a serious question. So here's someone having fun, but then thinking critically. And to carry on the sort of food analogy, I suppose you might think and reflect on the difference between a chef and a cook, and the fact that you have a sort of the cuisine, and high cuisine especially, is a blend of science and art. And so that kind of learning experience and how it differs from, say, the expectations that might be placed on you in practice is that you're really required to experiment and play in the way that a sort of chef might, instead of following a recipe always. Khisha, let's go on to the next slide, and then rather than go through student portfolios, we'll just have them as a backdrop during the Q&A, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. And I just wanted to add, just on the last slide, that in first year, fun and freedom is really important. It's really important that you enjoy the projects that you do, and you enjoy the research, and you enjoy developing them, because we can feel that when it's time to give you feedback.
So I think that when we titled this slide, we wanted to caveat that when we describe failure, we're talking about failure as a process, not as an outcome. Mm-hmm. So we don't want anyone to embark on a course and to just fail and crash out. But it's that to understand that failure as a process is such a powerful creative catalyst for ideas in itself, and such a important component of the learning cycle, and that reflective cycle that we talked about before. You know, you have to go through difficult circumstances sometimes to grow. And so when we're advocating for failure and to highlight in some ways failure as part of the feedback process, that is, we're saying that's a good thing in terms of the process and the experience. But obviously we don't want people to fail as an outcome. And so what you have to do is, I suppose, have that open mind from the very beginning, try things, take risks. And then, of course, when you're in the sort of closer to the delivery and closeout phase of a project, then you're using those experiences to deliver a fun and creative product. And we're not talking about failure at that point. So it's failure to enrich the process and to enhance the learning experience more than anything.
As a tutor, you want your student to be testing things out, testing ideas, testing physically as well as drawing and sketching, model making, whatever it may be. And those tests might result as failures. And that kind of produces what we call process work. Your tutor wants to see that. Your tutor isn't looking for the final solution to whatever question is being asked. And so in tutorials, when they're giving feedback, which comes in different ways, it might be verbal through tutorial, it might be through sketches and drawings, it might be written feedback, it might be feedback from a review, you know, an actual more formal feedback. So you've got kind of informal feedback and written feedback. To be able to give that feedback, they need something to feedback on, hence why it's either your drawings, your models, conversations, or questions. That's really important, that you approach your tutorials or reviews with that. The image that you can see here is actually what we call a crit, a review, where you pin your work up and the work is discussed or critiqued. That might be digitally on a forum like this, Teams, Zoom, whatever, or it might be physically on a wall. The process is the same. there's a discussion about that work, and the feedback is also discussion. It's really important that you take that feedback, whether it's verbal or written or audio, as the case may be, and you understand what that feedback is. You consider what elements of the feedback are important to you, and then that you progress the work in taking into consideration the feedback that you've given. This feedback is also an important part of that conversation, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And an architecture project, you'll find, is almost never finished. And so even if it's the final crit or review, it's still this idea of discussion. You think about, where could this work have gone if I had more time? What were you trying to do but maybe didn't quite achieve? And so,
sorry, Khisha. A bit of a lag, sorry. And I was just going to say, as a sort of rounding up point, that there's a big transformation that happens in students as they go through their first year of studying architecture, and that is that they listen, receive feedback, they then start to understand what it means to have a tutor as a critical friend, and then they suddenly realise that, hang on, I'm a critical friend to all my friends, all my peers, sometimes they're one and the same, and start to emulate, use the same vocabulary to be a critical friend to their friends and to their peers. And so that exposure to the way of discussing and using feedback as mechanisms as a tool, whether it's written feedback or a crit or a tutorial seminar or whatever, is that by the end of first year, we expect all students to become tutors in themselves, in a way, and be tutoring each other. And I think that now leaves us 10 minutes to come on to a bit of a Q&A. So Khisha's going to load up a bit of a show reel of a couple of student work, portfolios, just that we think embody a lot of the things we've been talking about. They've had a fun experience, so that will be rolling in the background. Anyone is welcome to put their mic on and ask a question, or if you prefer, you can put the question in the chat, and I'll kind of field those questions as well. So I'll open it up to the floor if anyone would like to start with a question.
Whilst we're waiting on that first question, can I also add that you are also to become a critical friend to yourself and look at your work with a critical eye and think about what you're doing as you're doing it. Can you see the portfolios?
We can, yeah.
Okay.
We'll let that
I can't see the questions, Ralph. So if everyone could turn on their screen so you can see each other, and feel free to ask questions with your voices as well.
Over to you guys.
This portfolio that we're going through is a foundation student, and you can see the breadth of work that she has done, and this would have been in discussion with her tutor backwards and forwards, and the work has developed as she's progressed through the course. So this is a foundation student portfolio.
Do feel free to just pop your mic on and ask a question, or put one in the chat and I'll read it out.
And that can be from students or tutors. The interesting thing about this portfolio is that she really tested model making, drawing, sketching, different ways of doing things. Not all of them were successful, but that wasn't the point, was that there was this testing going on, and she was encouraged by her tutor to kind of try these different things, and a lot of them for the first time.
Oh, there's a hand up from Sharika. Yeah, go for it, Sharika. Do you want to put your mic on? Oh, that hand's gone down. Maybe Bradley, do you want to jump in?
Can you hear me?
Go for it, Bradley. Do you want to just tell us whether you're a student or a tutor, or give us a bit of background and then ask your question?
So I'm a student, a RIBA Foundation student, and yeah, I'm coming to kind of like the end, I would say. And yeah, I've been enjoying it. So I kind of just, yeah, there was a lot of useful information, which, yeah, I'm definitely thankful for. I just wanted to kind of get some clarity, just kind of at the start. So finishing the foundation course, which I'm on, so there's kind of like two routes of the year one, which is full-time education, and then the certificate, which is kind of more, I'm guessing, as you were saying, like practice-based, like pretty much.
Exactly that. So on what grounds are you weighing up? Are you weighing it up on that one might be more compatible with your life, or is it that they're different learning experiences and you might choose one for that reason?
Yeah, I think the more the learning experiences. Actually, another question which I could probably ask, but yeah, because I'm thinking in the sense of on the obviously as you put on the kind of one of the diagrams you showed with the full-time education, um, the kind of practice experience is very kind of like distant. So kind of with the certificate course, I'm understanding that it's definitely like kind of more hands-on in terms of like you'll know how they do it and like how it goes day to day a lot more than if you were kind of just to do it in um, yeah, the full-time education. Um, and so yeah, they're kind of like on the studio course on the certificate. So is it kind of like the same content that you'd be learning if you were on the full-time or?
Khisha, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. So what you'll find is that the content is the same. It's just a different way of learning. And because on all courses, whether it's the full-time course or whether it's the RIBA Studio course, a distance course, what we're trying to get you to do is to think about a way of thinking. It's how you approach your projects. And that way of thinking, that kind of conceptual and critical response to a project or a brief is what you're being taught. So on the full-time course, they're being taught this. And on the RIBA certificate course, you're being taught this through that relationship with your tutor. So that tutor relationship is extremely important on the RIBA Studio course. The difference is that the kind of the time that it's done. So obviously in the certificate course, you're embedded in a practice, right? So you have got your kind of practicing architecture, might be at a different levels, but you're practicing architecture within a team. That team becomes part of that wider learning network, that community of learning that we talked about before. So you can ask them questions. They hopefully can see what you're doing. You're sharing what you're doing with them and they're feeding into that. You have got the benefit of having that complete poetic expression in the project that you're going on. So you're becoming a conceptual thinker. You're thinking about things that maybe might not be built, which gives you a little bit of license to really think out of the box and push that box really far. You can then go to practice and say, look, I've done research on cat houses in space. How can we apply this to our practice work? So you're feeding back into the practice. So that's kind of the benefit of kind of the distant learning course, because there are all these different people feeding into it. And in a way, you're driving it as well. You know, we said you get what you put in when it comes to unlocking those mindsets. So you can begin to think about what you're really interested in as you approach each brief. Whereas on the full-time course, they're also being taught that conceptual thinking. But if you remember the diagram, the graph with the kind of peaks and troughs is kind of more intensely clumped together within a year. So they've got 24 weeks in a year to get all their projects done. Whereas on the certificate, because you're responding to you might have family, you might have kids, you might have deadlines at work. So that ebb and flow of work might change a little bit depending on your kind of life circumstances. But what you're being taught at the end of it will be the same. You're being taught to become a critical thinker, a conceptual thinker, and that you then approach projects in a certain way. So that's when we talk about unlocking your mindsets. That's what we're trying to do. And that's the same for all courses. That's what we want. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Thank you. Yeah, that was a lot more. I'm
Okay.
a lot more clear in terms of going forward now. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks, Bradley. I'm glad that you've enjoyed your foundation experience. We've got a question here from Craig. Thanks very much for asking it, Craig. There's often quite a pressure at the end of each student project. How do you, as a tutor, deal with the idea of learning from failure when that particular project is finished? How do you keep the idea of continued learning, even though grades are being awarded? And Craig's thinking about becoming a part-time tutor. Thanks very much, Craig, for sharing. I think that first year is a particularly important platform because, and I'm trying to speak as much as possible to universal principles, not just Oxford Brookes specific or RIBA Studio specific, but generally speaking, most courses are set up so that the first year isn't part of the overall degree classification and isn't scrutinised necessarily in the same way in terms of the Royal Institute of British Architects curriculum learning outcomes. So there's a little bit more freedom and license in year one to really embody that risk taking and to find, design, let design projects find you through an open-minded kind of process, as opposed to you kind of trying to execute them in a very planned way. So more open to fun, creative freedom, serendipity, and say for example you're trying to learn engineering, which you might think of as a sort of pursuit in perfection. You get the most elegant bridge and you get the most efficient design, but that only comes from developing something conceptually, testing it until it fails, looking at when it failed, realizing that actually it failed quite a lot later than you thought. You can trim off loads more material, you can change the shape of certain elements, make it more elegant, start to play with the design parameters of that because you tested it to the point where it failed. So that point of failure is actually further down the road than you first thought, and by trying to move towards that point of failure, you found this really rich ground for design innovation in the middle. So sometimes you don't go, you don't have to go all the way to failure to get to that rich territory of innovation. And that's the sort of sweet spot for the bit that you described in your question about when you were approaching the end of a project. And so sometimes we're encouraging students to reach really far, even when they're getting quite close to the end of a project. And in first year, sometimes that manifests as a planned section elevation of a very well resolved project, and then something really radical and experimental, perhaps in terms of representation, perhaps in terms of modeling, just a single sort of isolated study that tries to launch the project. And it sort of says the student sort of saying, you know what, if I had more time, this is where I was going to go with it. And that is really freeing, because there's no obligation to then draw and have to do all of the kind of project delivery of that. It's just this kind of last sort of explosion of creative ideas. So sometimes if someone's got that energy and that appetite for risk and rewards, but we know that we've got to get them to deliver a sensible, marketable portfolio, that's the kind of way we shape that energy, and to great success as well. But it's a really good question, Craig. Thank you.
Also, can I add to that? I think it's really important that you think about how you frame the feedback. And we try to be kind in how we give feedback and constructive and honest in how we give feedback, so that students understand, well, this wasn't good for this reason, but we see the potential in what you could have done. Or we try and emphasize the strengths and the weaknesses of a project and of that student as well. So they understand it's not that you are a failure, it's just that this project didn't quite succeed in the way you intended it to. And if the student understands why it didn't succeed, and that your feedback is really clear, and often they end up saying, well, actually, I can see where you're coming back with this feedback. Maybe next time I can learn from that and I can do something better. And whether it's at the stage that Ralph was just talking about, just before a hand in, and it's just producing that one thing that shows the intention of a project that might save it. When you're going through a portfolio, you're like, yes, good. Ooh, yes, oh, this is great. Ooh, well, it didn't quite succeed, but this last image really shows me what their intention was. That can save a project at the end of it. But I think how we give our feedback and when we talk about critical friends, I think it's such a great phrase, because it's about framing that feedback in a way that they understand that it could have been what it is not at the moment, and that there's potential here, and here, but you need to work on this, and this in order to achieve that potential.
I think that's such a good way of kind of rounding things off, Khisha, isn't it? Is the title of this is about unlocking potential, and when we can see unlocked potential, there's a frustration there, because that's what we're there trying to unlock. And so this discussion around pushing toward failure is about leaving none of that potential untapped, and that comes from a kind of willingness on both sides to find that rich seam of creative expression.
Mm-hmm.
Melissa's got her hand up. Do you want to go for it? Pop your mic on, Melissa.
Hello, can you hear me? I think
We can hear you.
Your mic's off again. Let me see if I can.
Perhaps while Melissa's internet's down just a bit, should we just say, Craig, did you want to come back on any of those things, or expand a little bit on your question?
Oh, hello.
Oh, we've got Melissa back. Melissa, we just asked Craig if he wanted to just jump in. Craig said no.
Yeah, go for it. I'm sorry, yeah.
Craig shrugging it off. Okay, Melissa, you're back on. Go for it.
Okay. I was just wondering, it's probably not necessarily something that's relevant to me, but obviously when I started my architecture journey, there wasn't the option of having the studio option. So as much as a kind of transition to incorporate this as a student in that world, I think I'm quite curious as how you found that practices are adjusting to this new way of learning, and how I think immersing students in the professional realm is so important, and something that I wish was incorporated into my course as well. But you know, when practices are obviously running a business, I don't know, I'm just curious about how someone so early in their stage can feel as if they're actively contributing to the professional world as well. And I'm really curious about how that relationship works.
I mean, I had a foundation student work with me last year, and it's something that the foundation students do worry about, because like, but I haven't got any experience in architecture, how do I approach this? And I think what you have to remember as either someone hiring a student for the first time, or as a student who's going into practice for the first time for those kind of 200 hours, or interviewing for a job, is that you've got previous world experience. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what in architecture isn't just drawing plans, sections, and elevations. There's ways that you can contribute to a practice, and you're not going to be drawing the M&E layout on the first day in a practice. There's other things that you can be contributing to. It's not easy as a practice, because obviously you're busy, you've got things to do, you've got things done. So it requires a bit of understanding on both sides and a bit of managing of expectations on both sides. I had a student for 4 weeks for 2 days a week, and I was really impressed on how quickly they learned stuff. And we started off with small things like doing surveys and drawing up a survey, going on site visits. But I think that in that short period, it taught me as a practice to understand how somebody with not a lot of experience could help me out in a practice. As a practitioner, I had to think about, actually, because I'm a sole practitioner, how to structure my practice. You know, when you're working on your own, you're doing all this time, you have to think a bit more about, actually, what am I doing and why, and how do I tell somebody else to do that? So as a practice, I think you can learn from it. And as a student who's got no experience, you need to manage your expectations on what you're going to be doing, but then being open to what you can learn from each thing that you're doing when you're in that practice, whether it's learning CAD for the first time, using a tape measure for the third time to do a survey, sitting in on a client meeting, simply just taking notes. Just taking notes can be a really good, useful learning experience. And I've just had a 15-year-old working with me for a week. And in a week, she learned a lot and actually added things, because you've got a voice. She can make phone calls. She can call and ask about tiles. So there's lots of different ways. Mm-hmm. Embed in practice with no experience at all can help. And if you're coming from a different background, you're already in work, you can bring all of that to it as well. So don't kind of sell yourself short. There's a Ekaterina as well.
Yeah, Ekaterina's got a question regarding software skills for your first year. Do you want to go ahead and ask that by putting your mic on?
Yeah, I'll probably do that. That will be easier. So I think, at least from my experience as a tutor at foundation level, it looks like sometimes this idea of developing your design skills and thinking and sketching and actually iterating rather than arriving at the final proposal is a really hard ask. And on top of that, what I'm hearing is that students, it's a good thing for students to also have software skills. And here's a contradiction in my view. I think it's conflicting in a way when you're trying to push them to actually create more iterations of design, but at the same time they feel like they actually need to also be capable of using CAD or any other softwares that are obviously useful for the practice, but then at the foundation level, are you as a student really expected to have all of those skills when you actually go into your placement? And I wonder, for me, it's a question, let's say, where's that boundary? How far do we actually need to go between software versus design skills? Because I like to separate them, because let's say I'm in architecture for years now, so I can actually do both and there's no problem for me. But I feel like at the beginning, it's actually really hard for students not to dive into software issues and focus on the design. So I was wondering, what's your view on that one at those, let's say, foundation and part one level?
Yeah, I mean, I've got quite formal views on this, I think, because I have a lot of dialogue with students as they're preparing to enter the workplace, and the things that they say, you know, that they're very keen to make sure are emphasised on their CV, or that might improve their prospects to secure that job. But also at the front end, with teaching year one and that being being my specialism, I'm concerned with skills acquisition, and so what I've come to realise is that the most important thing is about students being aware of workflows in which the different stages of the workflow are interchangeable in terms of the software that's used. So if the workflow is do a sketch, scan the sketch, Photoshop the sketch, import the sketch into a 3D modeling software, try and make a model over the top of the sketch, take a screenshot of that, bring it back into Photoshop. You know, it doesn't really matter which software is at each one of those stages, and if you interchange them, you'll get different results. So persuading students to not place too much emphasis on their employability prospects of a particular single software package is quite a difficult thing to explain. But personally, I wouldn't want to go to a practice who wouldn't even interview me if I didn't know Revit. The point is I have an aptitude to learn Revit because I've already learned 6 of the other prominent softwares, and they're basically all the same. The buttons are just in a different place. So I think that the thing to do with students is to kind of go, okay, well, there's this whole workflow of things you're going to do to create from an idea to an output. Which one of those have you got as like anchors in your skill set already, workflow stages where you already know how to do that bit, and which bits are the bits that you can learn, and maybe try 2 or 3 different softwares and find which one is more experimental or more effective for you, and just sort of emphasizing it in that way. Does that kind of go some way to answering the question?
I guess it's somewhere like in between, like find a balance. That's probably the answer. Like don't completely rely purely on design skills, because yes, I agree, it's useful tools, they're good to use sometimes, but it's like, where do you really keep your hand on the pulse of a student and saying, okay, you went too far into software, you need to stop here and focus back on your design. So yeah, I guess that's probably somewhere in between.
I think it's a really great question, because I think we need to impress upon students that the software is a tool for realizing their conceptual designs. It's not going to design it for them. And interesting, during lockdown, for the first time, we started teaching CAD to the first year, like the full-time students. Before that, first year was all hand-drawn. And we could really see a difference in the output in terms of they got locked down a bit in the software and a bit lost in the software and forgot about the potential of the design. And so we're trying to find that balance as we're kind of coming out of lockdowns into how do you balance software versus conceptual design and not have software kind of strangle the possibilities of that conceptual design. So it definitely is a balance. And I think we also have to remember, each time you go to a different practice, you know, when I was saying about that, unlocking your ways of thinking, being able to then adapt, by changing your way of thinking, being able to adapt to different situations and being open to researching yourself how to deal with situations. So I was from the time where I didn't learn software until I was in a practice. And each time I changed practice, it was a different software. So first it was Vectorworks, next practice was AutoCAD. I had to completely learn AutoCAD from scratch. So even when you're a practicing architect, you're going to have to learn different softwares and different things at different times. If I went to another practice now, I don't know Revit at all, but I'm fully aware that I will have to learn Revit on the job or whatever in another practice that I go to. So it's that continuous learning. The photo Ralph showed of his practice of everybody being on different learning journeys, that definitely continues. So if you've got that openness and kind of way of thinking, the workflows that Ralph was mentioning, if we can impress upon the students that that's what's important, not CAD or Vectorworks or Revit or whatever the MicroStation is, then hopefully that will help them to understand the balance between these things.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it veers into a question of representation. I mean, like we've kind of covered the learning experience and the employability dimensions of it, but just representationally, if you just look at how the work looks at the surface level, if the software speaks more to the architecture than the architecture itself, you know, it kind of, oh well, that looks like a Revit model, it looks like an Illustrator drawing, it look, you know, that can be a danger. And I think also there's a lot of architectural motifs and trends in representation styles, and sometimes that's born out of social media, but also just software platforms kind of coming to the fore in terms of processes and styles and stuff like that. So you see that kind of stuff ebbs and flows, and you have that kind of that averaging effect. You know, when I studied, everyone put rain into their renders, so it was always look grungy and dark, and there was always a street lamp on and crows flying off in the distance and rain. You know, like that's not a thing now. Everyone's designing archways and there's like pink everywhere. So it's just and some of that comes from, as I say, just that dissemination of of pop culture influences, and some is software specific. And I suppose the important thing is emphasizing uniqueness and saying, well, there's a workflow we all go through to get from an idea to a product, and you can bring uniqueness in any one of those stages. But if it comes out that product looking like something or someone else's, then maybe it's not as successful in celebrating you as it could have been.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Just one quick one then. At part 1 level, then, can we do students actually get specific hours or specific softwares that they're pushed to do later on, or not? Or it's kind of more fluid and you just decide whatever works for your project?
So on the foundation course, this year we've tried to introduce more software than we did last year, for example, so there's an understanding. But they are told, we're aware of costs of software. Not everybody's got the money to pay for software. So they're introduced to software that's free, alternative, say, for example, Photoshop. We've introduced GIMP as an alternative to Photoshop because that's free, whereas Photoshop you have to pay for. AutoCAD, you get a free license as a student, etc. But they're also told that this is just one program and there are different options to look at, and they're encouraged to then use these to then develop the project that they're working on. They're given workshops separate to the actual design brief, if that makes sense. And then they're encouraged to use these programs to develop designs as they go forward. So I think, as Ralph was saying, it's definitely a backwards and forwards between the two. They're not necessarily taught a specific thing, but saying, so these are options that you can kind of go forward. For the courses in general, there's a certain hours, this course should take you this many hours, that should take you that many hours. But there is a level of initiative that students have to take, both on full-time courses and on distance courses. Some people are really into learning software and programs, and some people are not. And it's about kind of taking it upon yourself to learn that within the kind of, here's some training, here's an example of a program, now fly, little birdie, fly.
Joanna, just with an eye on the clock, I've realised we've overrun. Are we needing to wrap things up, do you think?
I think so, probably, Ralph,
Yeah.
Unless there's any more questions or hands raised. So I don't know if either of you wanted to make any final comments, or if not, we can kind of conclude there, I think. Yeah, I would say just bringing it back to the title, which is Unlocking Year One. We all just want to unlock everyone's maximum potential, and I hope we've introduced a couple of conceptual frameworks where you can, if you're a tutor, you can have a discussion with a student about softening those boundaries and transitions from network to network to help every group of people that people spend their time with and are exposed to help them unlock their potential. So it's not just all on the tutor to extract that potential, it's on everyone that they have a touch point with throughout the year and throughout the day. And then finally, it's just thinking about the legacy of this video on YouTube. So if anyone is listening to this as a prospective student, considering which course to study on, and you've made it all the way through an hour and 16 minutes, you're going to be a brilliant student, and I'm sure a brilliant architect, so well done. Khisha, over to you. Yeah, I just wanted to add that teaching first year or people at the beginning of their course is actually really rewarding and really fun. It's enjoyable. That's one of the reasons we do it, because you are starting from nothing, and you tend to put a lot of pressure on yourself, but you are starting from nothing as a foundation student, as a first year student. And the pride that we as tutors feel when we see that kind of learning curve, which is very steep in first year, from nothing to having buildings and a portfolio at the end of first year, at the end of foundation, is huge. And I don't want you to forget that as a student and as a tutor. And as tutors, we're very proud, whether that end portfolio is, a middle kind of performing portfolio, a low performing portfolio, or a high performing portfolio. It's about that learning journey that you've gone on. And that's what's really enjoyable about it. And that's why we say to you in first year, to kind of unlock your potential, have fun with it. Really don't put the pressure on yourself. You're not going to be this star architect at the end of first year. It's only first year. It's only first year. So enjoy it. That's it. Oh. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think all that remains is just to say thank you hugely to Khisha and Ralph. I hope everyone enjoyed that. I know I did. It was really interesting. Again, just a kind of brief nod, as Ralph said, if anyone is watching this on kind of YouTube or catch up and's got any queries, then we'll make sure the contact details are up here so you can get in touch. Thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you to those of you who contributed. Great question. Have a really enjoyable weekend. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.